The first gunshot rang out across the dusty street of Willow Creek as Piper Lawson crouched behind an overturned wagon, clutching her bleeding arm. It was 1876 in the Arizona Territory, and she'd just become the most wanted woman in the county for a crime she didn't commit. "Don't move!" Sheriff Dawson bellowed from behind the protection of the saloon's wooden pillar. "Give yourself up, Miss Lawson." Piper's heart hammered against her ribs. 3 days ago, she'd been a respected schoolteacher. Now she was accused of stealing from the town bank, all because she'd refused the unwanted advances of the banker's son, who had planted the money in her cottage out of spite. "I didn't do it!" she shouted back, her voice cracking with fear and exhaustion. "Please, you have to believe me." The sound of pounding hooves drew everyone's attention as a rider approached from the east, silhouetted against the setting sun. The stranger's arrival created just enough distraction for Piper to make her move. She bolted from behind the wagon toward the livery stable, ignoring the searing pain in her arm. The rider, a tall man with broad shoulders and a worn leather hat, observed the commotion with sharp eyes. In one fluid motion, he dismounted his chestnut stallion and stepped directly into Piper's path. "Get out of my way," she hissed, her honey-brown hair falling from its pins. The stranger looked at her with startling blue eyes. "You're bleeding, madam." "I'm also about to be hanged for something I didn't do." She tried to push past him, but her strength was fading. "Flynn Newcomb," he introduced himself calmly, as if they were meeting at a social gathering rather than in the middle of a manhunt. "And I believe you might need assistance." Before Piper could respond, Flynn swept her onto his horse and mounted behind her in one swift motion. With a sharp whistle, he urged his stallion forward, thundering out of town as bullets whizzed past them. "Hold on tight," he murmured against her ear as they galloped into the open desert, leaving Willow Creek and its accusations behind. Piper clung to the saddle horn, her consciousness fading as blood continued to seep through her sleeve. "Why are you helping me?" she managed to ask, her vision blurring. Flynn's arm tightened around her waist, keeping her securely in the saddle. "Let's just say, I've seen enough innocent people hang in my lifetime." The desert landscape blurred around them as they rode hard for hours, putting distance between themselves and the posse that would surely follow. The stars emerged in the clear sky above, and Piper struggled to stay awake. "We need to stop," Flynn said eventually, guiding his horse toward a small canyon. "You need tending to." He helped her dismount in a sheltered area beside a small spring, a rare oasis in the desert. Piper stumbled, her legs numb from the long ride, and Flynn caught her before she could fall. "I don't even know you," she whispered, looking up at him with feverish eyes. "Why would you risk your life for a stranger?" Flynn's weathered face revealed nothing as he eased her down onto his bedroll. "Let me see that arm first. Questions later." He worked methodically, cutting away the bloodied sleeve of her dress and cleaning the bullet graze with water from his canteen. Piper bit her lip to keep from crying out as he applied whiskey to disinfect the wound. "It's not as bad as it could be," he said, binding the wound with a strip of clean cloth. "The bullet just grazed you." In the flickering light of the small fire he'd built, Piper studied her rescuer. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 35 to her 23 years. His face bore the marks of a life lived hard under the western sun, with creases at the corners of his eyes and a scar that ran along his jawline. Despite his rough appearance, his hands were gentle as they tended to her wound. "You still haven't answered my question," she said when he finished. "Why help me?" Flynn sat back on his heels, his expression thoughtful. "I was passing through Willow Creek when I heard about a schoolteacher accused of theft. The story didn't sit right with me." He paused. "I've been following the situation for 2 days. Watched the banker's son acting mighty suspicious." Piper's eyes widened. "Harold Wilkins. He's been pursuing me since I arrived in town 6 months ago. When I rejected his proposal last week, Her voice trailed off. "He framed you," Flynn finished. "I figured as much. Men like that don't take kindly to being told no." "No one believed me," Piper said softly, staring into the flames. "I taught their children, broke bread with them after church on Sundays. Yet they were ready to see me hang based on his word alone." Flynn handed her a tin cup of coffee. "People believe what's convenient. Truth is rarely that." "What are you? Some kind of wandering lawman?" Piper asked, accepting the cup gratefully. A ghost of a smile touched Flynn's lips. Once. Not anymore. He didn't elaborate, and Piper didn't press. Everyone in the West had secrets, herself included. "What will you do now?" Flynn asked after a long silence. Piper laughed bitterly. "I can't go back. Even if we could prove Harold framed me, my reputation is ruined. No town will hire a schoolteacher with a scandal following her. You could start fresh somewhere else." "With what money? Everything I owned was in that cottage." She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling the desert's night chill. "I don't even have a change of clothes." Flynn rose and retrieved a worn leather saddlebag from his horse. "It's not much, but I have a spare shirt that might serve until we can get you something proper." He handed her a faded blue cotton shirt. "There's a trading post about a day's ride from here. We can get supplies there." "We?" Piper questioned, clutching the shirt. "Unless you'd prefer to make your way alone through Apache territory with a wounded arm and no supplies." Piper looked down, acknowledging the sense in his words. "I have no way to repay you." "I'm not asking for payment, Miss Lawson." "Piper," she corrected. "If we're going to be traveling together, you might as well use my name." Flynn nodded. "Get some rest, Piper. We leave at first light." As Piper settled onto the bedroll, Flynn took up position on the other side of the fire, his rifle across his lap. She watched him through half-closed eyes, wondering what kind of man risked everything for a stranger. Despite her exhaustion and pain, sleep eluded her as questions tumbled through her mind. "I can hear you thinking from here," Flynn said without looking at her. "Whatever's on your mind, it'll keep till morning." Piper hesitated. "I don't understand why anyone would believe in me when even people who've known me for months didn't." Flynn finally turned his gaze toward her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Sometimes a stranger sees clearer than those blinded by their own assumptions." With those words hanging in the air between them, Piper finally surrendered to exhaustion, drifting into a fitful sleep filled with dreams of pursuit and narrow escapes. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Dawn was just breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the canyon walls with hues of pink and gold. Flynn was already up, tending to a small cooking fire. "You should eat," he said, noticing she was awake. "We've got a long ride ahead." Piper sat up gingerly, wincing at the pain in her arm. She'd changed into Flynn's shirt during the night, and it hung loose on her smaller frame, the sleeves rolled up several times. She felt oddly vulnerable in the masculine garment, yet it was more practical than her torn and bloody dress had been. "How's the arm?" Flynn asked, handing her a tin plate with bacon and hardtack. "Sore, but better." She accepted the food gratefully. "Thank you." They ate in comfortable silence, watching the desert come alive with the rising sun. Birds called to one another from the sparse vegetation, and a jackrabbit darted between the rocks. "You never told me what you do," Piper said as she helped Flynn pack up their small camp. "If you're not a lawman anymore?" Flynn secured the bedroll behind his saddle. "Odd jobs mostly, some ranching, some scouting for the army when they need someone who knows the territory." "And you just happened to be in Willow Creek when I needed rescuing?" There was a hint of suspicion in her voice now that the immediate danger had passed. Flynn's expression remained impassive. "I was tracking someone, a man who killed my partner 2 years ago. Word was he'd been seen in that area." "Oh." Piper's suspicion dissolved. "Did you find him?" "Not yet." Flynn's jaw tightened. "But I will." They mounted up, Piper sitting behind Flynn this time, her arms wrapped tentatively around his waist. As they rode out of the canyon, she found herself studying the back of his neck, bronzed by the sun and marked with a thin white scar that disappeared beneath his collar. The trading post was exactly as Flynn had described, a collection of rough-hewn buildings situated at a crossroads between two infrequently used trails. A weathered sign proclaimed it Thompson's Trading Post and Way Station. "Not much to look at," Flynn commented as they approached. "But Hank Thompson is fair, and his wife Emma makes the best venison stew west of the Mississippi." A bell jangled as they entered the main building. The interior was dim after the bright sunlight, but Piper could make out shelves stocked with canned goods, tools, ammunition, and other essentials. A portly man with an impressive gray beard looked up from behind the counter. "Flynn Newcomb, as I live and breathe," he exclaimed. "Thought you might be dead by now." Flynn's mouth quirked into a half-smile. "Not for lack of trying on some folks' part, Hank." Hank's gaze shifted to Piper, eyes widening slightly at her appearance, a young woman in a man's shirt, with her hair loose around her shoulders and a bandaged arm. "This is Miss Piper Lawson," Flynn said smoothly. "She's had some trouble and needs supplies." To his credit, Hank asked no questions. "Emma's out back. She'll help the lady find what she needs." He gestured toward a door at the rear of the store. Piper glanced uncertainly at Flynn, who gave her a reassuring nod. "Go on." "I need to speak with Hank about some business." Emma Thompson proved to be a kind-faced woman in her 50s who took one look at Piper and ushered her into the family's living quarters behind the store. "Land's sakes, child, you look like you've been through the wars," she clucked sympathetically. "Let's get you fixed up proper." Within an hour, Piper had bathed in a real tub, had her wound properly redressed, and was dressed in a simple but serviceable blue calico dress that Emma had altered to fit her. Her hair was neatly braided, and she felt human again for the first time since her flight from Willow Creek. "I can't thank you enough," Piper said, as Emma packed a bundle of additional clothing and necessities. Emma waved away her thanks. "Any friend of Flynn Newcomb is welcome here. That man saved my Hank's life during the war." "You've known him long, then?" "Going on 15 years now. He passes through every few months, never stays long." Emma gave Piper a shrewd look. "He's a good man, despite what some might say." Piper wanted to ask what she meant, but Flynn appeared in the doorway at that moment, his expression unreadable as he took in Piper's transformed appearance. "We should get moving," he said after a brief pause. "Hank says there's been writers asking questions about a man and woman matching our description." Fear clutched at Piper's heart. "They've followed us this far?" "Money talks. The bank's offering a reward for your capture." Flynn turned to Emma. "We'll need food for several days, and I'll take that Winchester rifle Hank mentioned." Emma nodded briskly. "I'll have everything ready in 10 minutes. As they prepared to leave, Hank pulled Flynn aside for a private word. Piper couldn't hear what was said, but she noticed Flynn's posture stiffen before he nodded curtly. "What was that about?" she asked as they mounted up, her new belongings secured in saddlebags provided by the Thompsons. "Nothing that concerns us right now," Flynn replied, but Piper noticed a new tension in his shoulders as they rode away from the trading post. They traveled north, leaving the main trails and following game paths that wound through increasingly rugged terrain. Piper marveled at Flynn's navigational skills as he guided them through a landscape that looked featureless to her untrained eye. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. "There's a place up in the mountains, an old mining cabin. It's abandoned now, but the roof's still good. We can lie low there while we figure out our next move." Piper digested this information. "You seem to have a lot of hiding places." Flynn glanced back at her. "In my line of work, it pays to know where you can disappear if needed." "And what line of work is that exactly?" Piper pressed. "You've been very vague about it." Flynn was silent for so long that Piper thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I hunt men, Miss Lawson, men who've committed crimes but escaped justice." "You're a bounty hunter," Piper realized. "Among other things." There was a hardness to his tone that discouraged further questions. They made camp that night in a small grove of cottonwoods beside a creek. Flynn built a fire and cooked a simple meal of beans and salt pork from their supplies. As they ate, Piper sensed his preoccupation and decided to share something of herself. "I came west from Boston 3 years ago," she said into the silence. "My parents died of influenza, leaving me with no family and few prospects. Teaching seemed the only respectable option for a woman alone." Flynn looked up from his plate. "Why Willow Creek?" "They advertised for a teacher in a Boston newspaper. The salary was modest, but they offered housing and promised a respectable community ideal for a young lady of good character." Piper laughed softly. "I was naive enough to believe it." "It could have been worse," Flynn observed. "Some of those advertisements are nothing but traps for desperate women." Piper nodded soberly. "I've heard the stories. At least Willow Creek actually wanted a teacher. The children were wonderful." Her voice caught. "I'll miss them." "You could teach elsewhere," Flynn suggested. "Once this business with the bank is cleared up." "How would that happen? It's my word against Harold Wilkins, and his father owns half the county." Flynn set his plate aside. "Evidence has a way of surfacing when you know where to look." "You do that? Help clear my name?" Piper stared at him, hope rising unexpectedly. I might. Flynn's eyes met hers across the fire. But first, we need to get you somewhere safe. The next day brought them into higher elevations, where pine trees replaced the desert vegetation. The air grew cooler, and Piper was grateful for the warm shawl Emma had included in her bundle of clothes. By late afternoon, they reached a small plateau overlooking a valley, a crude cabin nestled against the hillside, nearly invisible among the trees. "Home, sweet home," Flynn remarked dryly as they approached. "At least for now." The cabin was rustic but surprisingly sturdy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and rough-hewn furniture, a table, 2 chairs, and a bed frame filled the single room. Dust covered everything, but the roof was intact as Flynn had promised. "I'll see to the horse," Flynn said after they had unloaded their supplies. "You might want to get a fire started. Nights get cold up here." While Flynn tended to his stallion, Piper busied herself sweeping out the worst of the dust and cobwebs. She found kindling and logs stacked beside the fireplace and managed to get a small fire going. By the time Flynn returned, the cabin felt almost habitable. "Not bad," he commented, surveying her work. "You've made it downright homey." "It just needed a woman's touch," Piper replied, then blushed at the domestic implication of her words. If Flynn noticed her discomfort, he didn't show it. "I'll take the floor," he said matter-of-factly, nodding toward the bed. "You need proper rest to heal that arm." Piper wanted to protest, but knew he was right. Her arm was throbbing after the day's long ride. They settled into a surprisingly comfortable routine over the next few days. Flynn hunted and chopped wood, while Piper maintained the cabin and prepared meals from their supplies. They spoke little, but the silence between them gradually shifted from awkward to companionable. On the 4th evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Flynn finally broached the subject that had been hanging between them. "I need to go back to Willow Creek," he said abruptly. Piper looked up sharply from the socks she was darning. "That's madness. They'll be watching for you. They're looking for a man traveling with a woman. One man alone won't draw the same attention." Flynn leaned forward, his expression intent. "If I can find proof that Harold Wilkins planted that money, you could go back with your name cleared. And if you can't, or worse, if you're caught," Piper set aside her mending, "they'll hang you as my accomplice. I've faced worse odds." The firelight cast shadows across Flynn's face, highlighting the scar along his jaw. "Besides, I have business of my own there." Understanding dawned on Piper. "The man you're tracking, he's in Willow Creek?" Flynn nodded slowly. "According to Hank, a man matching his description has been working as a deputy for Sheriff Dawson these past few months." "Deputy Mills?" Piper recalled the taciturn man who joined the sheriff's office shortly before she arrived. "What did he do?" "Shot my partner in the back during a prisoner transfer." Flynn's voice was flat. "Took the prisoner and the bounty money. Left Riley to die in the dirt." Piper's heart sank. Flynn wasn't just helping her out of altruism, he had his own vengeance to pursue in Willow Creek. "So, I was just a convenient excuse to go back." Flynn's gaze snapped to hers, his eyes hard. "If that were true, I'd have left you at the trading post and gone on alone. Then why bring me all the way up here, only to leave?" "Because," Flynn said, his voice softening slightly, "I needed to know you'd be safe while I was gone." The air between them seemed to thicken. Piper was acutely aware of Flynn's presence across the small table, the breadth of his shoulders, the faint scent of leather and pine that clung to him, the intensity in his blue eyes. "I still think it's too dangerous," she said finally, breaking the tension. "Noted?" Flynn's mouth quirked. "But I'm still going." "When?" "First light tomorrow. The sooner I go, the sooner I can return." Piper nodded, resigned. "What should I do if you don't come back?" Flynn reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "This is a map to a ranch about 40 miles east of here. Man named Josiah Banks owns it. Tell him Flynn sent you, he'll give you work and a place to stay." Piper took the paper, her fingers brushing against his. "How long should I wait?" 2 weeks. If I'm not back by then, I won't be coming back at all." The stark reality of his words hung in the air between them. Piper folded the map carefully and tucked it into her pocket, unwilling to examine why the thought of Flynn not returning caused such a hollow feeling in her chest. "Be careful," she said softly. Flynn stood, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. Always am. Piper woke before dawn to find Flynn already prepared to leave. He had dressed in clean clothes and strapped on a gun belt she hadn't seen before, with a Colt revolver worn low on his hip, the mark of a man who used his weapon professionally. "There's enough supplies to last you 3 weeks," he said, as he checked his saddlebags. "Keep the rifle close, but don't waste ammunition hunting unless you have to. There's a stream about 50 yards behind the cabin for fresh water." Piper nodded, clutching her shawl around her shoulders against the pre-dawn chill. "I'll manage." Flynn paused in his preparations to look at her properly. In the gray light filtering through the cabin window, Piper appeared younger and more vulnerable than she had on the trail. The thought of leaving her alone troubled him more than he cared to admit. "Stay close to the cabin," he instructed. "This area is generally peaceful, but you never know who might pass through." "I understand." Piper hesitated, then stepped forward and placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you." "For everything." Flynn looked down at her hand, then back to her face. For a moment, Piper thought he might say something more, but instead, he simply nodded and turned away to finish saddling his horse. The sun was just peeking over the horizon when Flynn mounted up. 2 weeks, he reminded her. "If I'm not back by then—" "I know," Piper interrupted. "Go to Josiah Banks." Flynn touched the brim of his hat in salute, then turned his horse toward the trail leading down from the plateau. Piper watched until he disappeared among the trees, then returned to the cabin that suddenly seemed much emptier than before. The days passed with agonizing slowness. Piper kept busy cleaning the cabin thoroughly, gathering wild berries that grew nearby, and reading the 2 books Flynn had left behind, a dog-eared copy of The Last of the Mohicans and a surprisingly well-preserved Bible. At night, she struggled to sleep, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wilderness and worrying about Flynn's fate in Willow Creek. On the 10th day, a thunderstorm rolled through the mountains. Rain pounded on the cabin roof, and lightning split the sky as Piper huddled by the fire, trying to distract herself with mending. A particularly loud crack of thunder made her jump, and as the sound faded, she heard something else, hoofbeats approaching the cabin. Heart racing, Piper grabbed the Winchester rifle and positioned herself beside the door. It could be Flynn returning early, but it could just as easily be someone else. She held her breath as the hoofbeats stopped outside. A moment later, a knock sounded on the door. "Piper, it's me." Flynn's voice sent relief flooding through her. She lowered the rifle and unbarred the door to find him standing there, soaked to the skin and looking exhausted. "You're back," she said unnecessarily, stepping aside to let him enter. Flynn removed his dripping hat and coat, hanging them by the fire to dry. "Not quite the welcome I expected," he remarked, nodding at the rifle she still held. "Better cautious than dead," Piper replied, setting the weapon aside. "You're back early. Did you find what you were looking for?" Flynn's expression darkened. "Mills wasn't there. Left town 3 days before I arrived, according to the bartender at the saloon." "I'm sorry," Piper said softly. "And what about Harold Wilkins? That's a different story." Flynn reached into his shirt and withdrew a folded paper. "Seems the banker's son has been busy. This is a confession, signed by the teller who helped him plant the money in your cottage." Piper took the paper with trembling hands, reading the statement that confirmed everything she'd claimed. "How did you get this?" "Let's just say Mr. Roberts had a crisis of conscience after a long conversation." The dangerous edge in Flynn's voice suggested the conversation had involved more than words. "He's prepared to testify that Harold coerced him into helping frame you. So I could go back, clear my name?" Flynn's expression softened slightly. "You could. Sheriff Dawson has already withdrawn the charges based on Robert's statement." The town council issued a formal apology. Joy surged through Piper, followed quickly by uncertainty. "What about Harold?" "Fled town when his scheme unraveled. His father disowned him publicly. Seems this wasn't the first time he'd caused trouble." Flynn moved closer to the fire, steam rising from his damp clothes. "You could have your teaching position back, if you wanted it." Piper absorbed this information, trying to sort through her jumbled emotions. After days of isolation, wondering if she'd ever be able to show her face in civilization again, the prospect of returning to her former life should have been purely joyful. Instead, She felt strangely conflicted. "What will you do now?" she asked, watching Flynn's profile in the firelight. "Keep tracking Mills." He stared into the flames. Word is, he headed north, toward Wyoming territory. And then? Flynn shrugged. "Find another bounty, I suppose. It's what I do." The thought of Flynn riding away to his solitary life of hunting men left Piper with an unexpected hollow feeling. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd had plenty of time to examine her growing feelings for this complicated man who'd risked his life to save hers. What if there were other options? She asked carefully. Flynn turned to look at her, his expression guarded. Such as? Piper took a deep breath. "I don't think I want to go back to Willow Creek. Even with my name cleared, people will talk. There will always be those who believe the worst. Where would you go instead?" "I don't know. Somewhere new, perhaps. Start fresh." Piper stepped closer to him, gathering her courage. "I just know that I'm tired of being alone." Understanding dawned in Flynn's eyes. "Piper, before you say anything, I know what you're thinking," she hurried on. "I'm younger than you. We've only known each other a short time. Your life isn't suited for attachments." She faltered slightly on the last word. Flynn remained silent, his face unreadable. "But these past weeks have changed me," Piper continued. "When they were hunting me, ready to hang me for something I didn't do, I realized how fragile everything is: reputation, security, life itself. The only thing that matters is being true to yourself and those you care about." "And you care about me?" Flynn's voice was low, almost skeptical. "I do." Piper met his gaze steadily. "I know it's sudden and probably foolish, but I do." Flynn ran a hand through his damp hair, looking more uncertain than she'd ever seen him. "Piper, my life isn't simple. I have enemies. I've done things I'm not proud of." "I'm not asking for simple," she replied. "I'm just asking for honest." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, the storm continued to rage, rain lashing against the cabin windows. Flynn took a step toward her, close enough that she could see the droplets of water still clinging to his eyelashes. "I came back early because I couldn't stop thinking about you up here alone," he admitted finally. "Rode through the night, through this storm, because I was worried." "About me?" Piper asked, hope rising in her chest. "About you." Flynn's hand came up to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. "You've gotten under my skin, Piper Lawson, and that hasn't happened to me in a very long time." Piper leaned into his touch. "Is that such a bad thing?" "It could be," Flynn murmured, "for both of us. Or it could be the beginning of something better than either of us has known before." Flynn's eyes searched hers, as if looking for any sign of doubt or deception. Finding none, he slowly bent his head and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so tender it brought tears to her eyes. When they parted, Piper reached up to trace the scar along his jaw. "We're both a little broken, I think," she whispered. Flynn caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "Then, perhaps we can heal together." The storm raged through the night, but Piper barely noticed. She and Flynn talked for hours by the firelight, sharing pieces of their pasts that they'd kept hidden. Flynn told her about his years as a Union scout during the war, about becoming a lawman afterward, and then a bounty hunter when the constraints of a badge became too limiting. Piper shared her own story, the lonely years after her parents' deaths, her decision to come west seeking independence, and her disillusionment with the reality she found. "What will we do now?" Piper asked as dawn approached, her head resting on Flynn's shoulder as they sat before the dying fire. "First, I need to finish what I started with Mills," Flynn said. "I owe Riley that much." Piper nodded against his shoulder. "And after?" Flynn was quiet for a moment. "Josiah Banks, the rancher I told you about, has been after me for years to come work with him. Says he needs someone who knows horses and can handle trouble when it comes. The pay's not much, but it's honest work." "And he'd have room for a schoolteacher?" Piper asked hesitantly. Flynn tilted her chin up to look at him. "The settlement near his ranch has been trying to establish a proper school for years. Currently, the children are taught by the preacher's wife whenever she can spare the time." Hope blossomed in Piper's chest. "That sounds promising." "It won't be easy," Flynn cautioned. "The territory's still wild, winters are harsh, and I can't promise that my past won't catch up with us someday." "Nothing worth having comes easy," Piper replied. "And I'd rather face whatever comes with you than alone." Flynn's arms tightened around her. "Then we'll go together. After Mills." "After Mills," Piper agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. The journey to Wyoming Territory took nearly 3 weeks. They traveled cautiously, staying off main trails and camping under the stars most nights. Flynn taught Piper how to shoot properly, how to track game, and how to read the weather in the changing clouds. In return, she shared her knowledge of plants and their medicinal uses, read to him from The Last of the Mohicans in the evenings, and gradually coaxed more smiles from his usually stern countenance. They reached Laramie in early October, when the aspen trees were turning gold against the dark pines. According to Flynn's sources, Mills had taken a job as security at one of the saloons in town. They took rooms at a small boarding house on the outskirts, with Flynn registering them as Mr. and Mrs. Newcomb, a fiction that made Piper blush, but one she didn't contradict. "I need to do this alone," Flynn told her on their first evening in town. "Mills is dangerous, and he won't hesitate to use anyone close to me as leverage." Piper wanted to argue, but knew he was right. "Promise me you'll be careful. No unnecessary risks." Flynn cupped her face in his hands. "I've got something to live for now. I won't forget that." He left her with a kiss and the loaded Winchester beside the bed. Piper paced the small room anxiously, watching the street through the window as darkness fell over Laramie. Hours passed with no sign of Flynn. The saloons would be busy now, filled with cowboys, railroad workers, and the usual assortment of gamblers and drifters that populated western towns. Just after midnight, Piper heard gunshots in the distance, 3 in rapid succession, then 2 more. Her heart seized with fear as she clutched the windowsill, straining to see through the darkness. More shots followed, and shouts echoed between the buildings. Unable to bear the waiting any longer, Piper threw a shawl over her shoulders and hurried downstairs, ignoring the landlady's protests. The night air was crisp with the promise of frost as she made her way toward the commotion. A crowd had gathered outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, where lanterns cast long shadows across the dusty street. "What happened?" she asked a bystander. "Shooting inside," the man replied, craning his neck to see better. "Some fella called out Jenkins the bouncer for being a wanted man. Got real ugly, real fast." Piper pushed through the crowd, fear driving her forward. At the saloon entrance, she found the sheriff and his deputies keeping people back while they dealt with whatever had happened inside. Through the swinging doors, she caught glimpses of overturned tables and shattered glass. "Flynn!" she called out, trying to see past the lawmen. A deputy turned at her cry. "You know someone involved, madam?" My husband," Piper said, the word strange on her tongue. "Flynn Newcomb. He came here tonight looking for a man." The deputy's expression softened slightly. "Tall fellow with a scar along his jaw?" Piper nodded frantically. "Please, is he all right?" "He's with the doc," the deputy said, gesturing toward a building down the street. "Took a bullet to the shoulder, but he was walking and talking when they left. The other fellow wasn't so lucky." Relief made Piper's knees weak. "Thank you," she managed, already turning toward the doctor's office. She found Flynn sitting on an examination table, his shirt off and his left shoulder bandaged. His face was pale beneath his tan, but his eyes lit up when she entered. "I told you to stay at the boarding house," he said, but there was no real reproach in his tone. "And I told you no unnecessary risks," Piper countered, moving to his side. "Are you all right?" The doctor, an elderly man with spectacles perched on his nose, answered for him. "Clean through the shoulder, missed anything vital. He'll have limited use of the arm for a few weeks, but with proper care, he should heal completely." "Mills?" Piper asked quietly. "Dead," Flynn replied, his expression somber rather than triumphant. "He drew first, left me no choice." The doctor cleared his throat. "The sheriff will want statements from both of you in the morning, but he's satisfied this was self-defense. Mills, or Jenkins as he was calling himself, had quite a reputation for violence. Town's probably better off." After settling the doctor's fee, they made their way slowly back to the boarding house. Flynn leaned on Piper more heavily than he would have normally allowed, betraying his exhaustion and pain. "It's over," he said as they reached their room. "Riley can rest easy now." Piper helped him remove his boots and eased him onto the bed. "How do you feel?" Flynn was quiet for a moment, considering. Not what I expected, he admitted finally. All this time, I thought killing Mills would bring some kind of peace. Instead, I just feel tired. Piper sat beside him on the bed, taking his hand in hers. Maybe peace comes from what we build, not what we destroy. Flynn's fingers tightened around hers. You might be right. He looked up at her, his eyes reflecting the lamplight. Are you ready to see if Josiah Banks still needs that school teacher? Piper's heart lightened at the question. I am if you are. There's something I need to ask you first, Flynn said, his expression suddenly serious. Something I've been thinking about for a while now. Piper felt her pulse quicken. Yes? I know we haven't done this in any kind of conventional order, Flynn began, and I don't have much to offer except my name and whatever future we can build together, but I can't imagine that future without you in it. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. Piper Lawson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Properly, I mean, not just for boarding house registers. Joy bloomed in Piper's chest, so intense it brought tears to her eyes. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will. Flynn pulled her down beside him with his good arm, his kiss a promise of all that was to come. 3 days later, they were married by the local preacher in a simple ceremony with the doctor and landlady as witnesses. Piper wore a new dress of deep blue calico, and Flynn had splurged on a proper suit despite his bandaged shoulder making it difficult to wear. It's not the wedding most girls dream of, Flynn said apologetically as they left the small church. Piper squeezed his hand. It's perfect because it's ours. The journey to Josiah Banks's ranch took another week, following the North Platte River through increasingly beautiful country. The ranch itself was nestled in a valley protected by mountains on 3 sides, with vast pastures for cattle and horses. Josiah Banks proved to be a burly man, in his 50s, with a booming laugh and a firm handshake. He welcomed Flynn like a long-lost brother and treated Piper with respectful courtesy that quickly warmed to genuine friendliness. About time you settled down, Newcomb, he declared after hearing their story. Been telling you for years that bounty hunting's a young man's game. The ranch house was spacious, with several unused rooms that Josiah insisted they take for their own. Been rattling around in this place by myself too long, he explained. Be good to have family here. The settlement Josiah had mentioned was a growing community about 3 miles from the ranch, close enough for convenience but far enough to maintain privacy. As Flynn had predicted, they were overjoyed at the prospect of a trained teacher for their children. We can convert the old meeting hall into a proper schoolhouse, the town council chairman told Piper enthusiastically. Have it ready before the first snow if we all pitch in. By Thanksgiving, they were settled into a routine that suited them both. Flynn worked with Josiah, breaking horses and managing the ranch operations while his shoulder healed completely. Piper taught in the newly established school during the day and helped with ranch accounts in the evenings. They rode to and from town together most days, getting to know their new home and its people. Winter came early that year, blanketing the valley in snow by early December. The ranch house was warm and snug, with fires blazing in every hearth and the smell of pine boughs decorating the mantels for Christmas. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire in their private sitting room, Piper finally shared the news she'd been keeping to herself until she was certain. I have something for you, she said, handing Flynn a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Flynn unwrapped it curiously to find a tiny pair of knitted booties. He stared at them uncomprehendingly for a moment before understanding dawned in his eyes. Piper, are you? She nodded, her eyes shining with happy tears. In June, the doctor thinks. Flynn set the booties carefully aside and pulled Piper into his arms, his kiss conveying everything words couldn't express. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers. I never thought I'd have this, he confessed softly. A home, a family, a future worth fighting for. They say I'm broken, she whispered, thinking of all the doubts and fears that had plagued her since leaving Willow Creek. The trauma of being falsely accused, the loss of her reputation and security, the uncertainty of starting over in a new place, all of it had left its mark on her spirit. Flynn kissed her hand tenderly, his eyes never leaving hers. To me, you're whole, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. More than whole, you're everything. As the snow fell softly outside their window and the fire crackled in the hearth, Piper knew they had found something precious and rare, a love that saw beyond scars and mistakes to the promise of healing together. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side, no longer broken but stronger for having found each other. The months passed swiftly as winter gave way to spring. The valley bloomed with wildflowers, and new calves and foals appeared in the pastures. Piper continued teaching until May, when her advancing pregnancy made the daily ride to town too uncomfortable. The community sent a steady stream of visitors bearing gifts for the baby and offers of help once the little one arrived. On a warm June evening, after a labor that lasted through the night and into the following day, Piper gave birth to a daughter with Flynn's blue eyes and a dusting of her own honey-brown hair. They named her Hope, a testament to the future they had created together against all odds. "She's perfect," Flynn whispered, cradling his daughter with a gentleness that brought tears to Piper's eyes. "Just like her mother." Piper reached out to touch his face, tracing the scar that she now knew every contour of. "We made this, Flynn. A family." "The best bounty I ever claimed," he replied with a smile that transformed his usually serious face. As summer turned to fall again, marking a year since they had come to the ranch, Josiah Banks made an announcement that changed their lives once more. Over dinner one evening, the older man cleared his throat and fixed Flynn with a significant look. "Been thinking," he said, refilling his coffee cup. "I'm getting too old to run this place alone. Been considering taking on a partner." Flynn set down his fork. "What are you saying, Josiah?" "I'm saying I want you and Piper to be my partners in this ranch. Equal shares. When I'm gone, it all goes to you and that little girl of yours." Josiah's gruff voice softened as he glanced at Hope, sleeping peacefully in a cradle beside the table. Piper gasped. "Josiah, that's too generous. We couldn't possibly—" "It's not generosity," Josiah interrupted. "It's good business. Flynn knows horses better than any man I've met, and you've got a head for figures that's kept our books straighter than they've ever been." He leaned back in his chair. "Besides, I never had children of my own. Like to think this place will go to people who'll care for it properly." Flynn and Piper exchanged a look filled with shared emotion. "We'd be honored," Flynn said finally, extending his hand to the older man. Josiah's weathered face split into a broad grin as he shook Flynn's hand. "Then it's settled. We'll draw up the papers tomorrow." That night, as they lay in bed with Hope sleeping in her cradle beside them, Piper marveled at how far they had come from that desperate flight from Willow Creek. "Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" she asked, nestled against Flynn's chest. "Partners in a ranch, parents to the most beautiful baby in Wyoming territory?" Flynn's fingers trailed along her arm. "Never. I figured I'd die with a gun in my hand, probably shot in the back like Riley. And now? Now I plan to live a very long time," Flynn said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Long enough to see Hope grow up, maybe give her some brothers and sisters. Long enough to grow old with you." Piper smiled in the darkness. "I like that plan." 2 years later, Piper stood on the front porch of their home, expanded now to accommodate their growing family with the addition of a son, Samuel, born the previous winter. She watched as Flynn rode in from the pastures, Josiah beside him, and several ranch hands following with a herd of newly purchased horses. Hope, now a sturdy toddler with her father's determined expression, squealed with delight at the sight of the horses and would have run straight into their path if Piper hadn't caught her. "Patience, little one," she laughed. "Daddy will be here soon." Flynn dismounted with the easy grace that still made Piper's heart skip, even after 3 years of marriage. He swung Hope up into his arms, her giggles carrying across the yard as he tossed her into the air. "How's my best girl?" he asked, planting a noisy kiss on her cheek. "Horse daddy," Hope demanded, pointing at the animals being led to the corral. "That's right, horses," Flynn agreed. "And when you're bigger, I'll teach you to ride the best one." He set Hope down and came up the steps to where Piper stood with Samuel in her arms. The baby reached for him immediately, recognizing his father despite being only 6 months old. "And how are you?" Flynn asked Piper, leaning in for a kiss after taking Samuel. "Happy," she replied simply. It was the truth, a bone-deep contentment that had become her constant companion. That evening, after the children were asleep, Flynn and Piper sat on the porch swing, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The scent of pine and wildflowers hung in the air, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "I got a letter today," Piper said, breaking the comfortable silence. "From Emma Thompson at the trading post." Flynn's arm tightened around her shoulders. "What news?" "Harold Wilkins was killed in a bar fight in California." Piper had long since put the man who tried to ruin her life out of her mind, but the news still stirred complex emotions. "Emma thought we should know." Flynn was quiet for a moment. "Do you feel anything? Relief? Sadness?" "Mostly I feel distance," Piper replied thoughtfully. "Like it happened to someone else in another lifetime." "In a way, it did." Flynn's fingers traced idle patterns on her shoulder. "We're different people now than we were then." Piper nodded against his chest. "Better people, I think." "Definitely better," Flynn agreed. "At least I am. You were always good, just needed someone to see it." Piper smiled at the memory those words evoked. "They say I'm broken," she quoted softly. Flynn completed the exchange that had become a private ritual between them, lifting her hand to his lips. "To me, you're whole." As the stars continued their ancient dance above the ranch that was now their home, Piper reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From false accusations and desperate flight to love and family, and a future brighter than either of them could have imagined, they had both been broken in their own ways by loss, by violence, by betrayal, but together they had found wholeness. And in that wholeness, they had built something beautiful.